Before we begin, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments below. A time when protecting someone you love meant you had to risk your relationship with them. Now, listen closely. My daughter saw me as a relic, a man whose mind was as faded as the ink in the old passbook savings ledgers I once managed. She believed my caution was a symptom of senility, my questions a sign of a mind that couldn't grasp the brilliant, fast-paced world of modern investments. Her new fiancé, a man with a dazzling smile and a portfolio of dazzling promises, agreed with her. To them, I was a harmless old fool, a ghost from a bygone era of paper trails and handshakes, an inconvenient variable in their perfect, glittering future. They didn't understand that for 40 years as a bank manager, my job wasn't just to count money, it was to read people. I had seen every lie, every deception, every carefully constructed house of cards that desperate and greedy men can build. I could smell a bad investment from a mile away, and her fiancé smelled like ruin. I tried to warn her, but my words were dismissed as the ramblings of a man living in the past. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I began a quiet, methodical investigation, a final secret audit. I knew it would culminate at their engagement party, a celebration of their shared future. But it would not be a celebration. It would be an intervention. I would have to destroy my daughter's happiness in order to save her, and I was prepared to have her hate me forever if it meant protecting her from the wolf she had welcomed into her home. My world has always been one of quiet, verifiable truths. For 40 years, I was the manager of a local branch of a national bank, a position that sounds far grander than the reality. The reality was a daily immersion in the lives and finances of my community. I didn't just manage accounts, I managed relationships. I learned to read the subtle language of risk, not just in market trends, but in the flicker of a man's eyes as he applied for a loan he knew he couldn't afford, or the forced optimism of a woman starting a business on a prayer. My profession was built on a foundation of trust, but that trust was earned through a rigorous, almost religious devotion to due diligence. You trusted, but you always verified. Now in retirement, that structure is gone. My days are quiet, marked by the rustle of the newspaper and the slow, methodical care of the garden my late wife Margaret so loved. The silence of my house is a constant companion, a testament to a life well lived, but now winding down. The loudest noise is often the ache in my heart for my daughter Evelyn. Evie. She lost her husband, a fine young man named Tom, in a senseless car accident 2 years ago. The grief hollowed her out, leaving her adrift in a world that had suddenly lost its anchor. Tom had been a planner, a man much like myself in his careful approach to life. He had left Evie with a substantial life insurance policy and a solid inheritance, a final act of love designed to give her and my grandson Sam a lifetime of security. But security, I knew, was a fragile thing, and grief made a person vulnerable, a prime target for predators who feed on hope. The predator arrived 6 months ago, and his name was Julian Croft. He was on the surface everything a grieving woman could want. He was handsome, attentive, and radiated a confident, easy charm that seemed to fill the empty spaces in Evie's life. He was a financial advisor, he said, an independent consultant who specialized in next-generation wealth management. He spoke a language of fintech cryptocurrencies and disruptive startups that made my own talk of mutual funds and treasury bonds sound like the scribblings of a caveman. He charmed Evie, he charmed little Sam, and he did his damnedest to charm me. But I am a difficult man to charm. I have sat across the desk from too many men who could sell sand in the desert only to watch them default on their first payment. The first time Julian came to my house for dinner, I listened more than I spoke. He talked about his portfolio of clients, his travels, his uncanny ability to predict market trends. "The old models are dead, Arthur. he'd said, calling me by my first name with an unearned familiarity. The 9-to-5 401k world your generation built. It's a dinosaur. The new economy is about agility, about seeing the angles. It's about leveraging assets in a decentralized marketplace. It all sounded impressive. It also sounded like utter nonsense. It was a word salad of buzzwords designed to intimidate and impress, not to inform. When I asked a simple question about the risk profile of his recommended investments, he'd just laughed. Risk is a function of knowledge, he'd said smoothly. For the uninformed, it's high. For those of us who understand the digital asset space, it's practically negligible. Later that evening, after he'd left, I tried to gently probe with Evie. He seems very confident, sweetheart. She had been washing dishes, but she turned to me, her eyes shining with a defensive light. He's brilliant, Dad. He's the smartest man I've ever met. He's helping me. Tom's portfolio was so safe, so boring. Julian says it was barely keeping up with inflation. He's showing me how to make that money actually work for me and Sam. Safe and boring are beautiful words to a banker, Evie, I'd said. They mean security. They mean stability. Her face hardened. And they mean stagnation. Dad, I love you, but you don't understand this world. Your idea of an investment is a 2% return on a certificate of deposit. Julian is talking about things that can secure Sam's entire future in a few years, not a few decades. She took a deep breath and her voice softened, but the words still stung. You're from a different time. It's okay. You don't need to worry about this. Julian is handling everything. Over the next few months, the situation escalated. Evie, under Julian's guidance, began to liquidate Tom's carefully constructed portfolio. The blue-chip stocks, the municipal bonds, the mutual funds, all of it was being sold off. When I asked her where the money was going, she was vague. It's going into a consolidated growth fund, she'd said, reciting a line I was certain Julian had fed her. It's a private fund Julian manages. Much higher returns. A private fund. My blood ran cold. That meant no public oversight, no SEC filings, no transparency. It was a black box. The final terrible confirmation came one afternoon when I dropped by her house unannounced. I found her on the phone with her lawyer, the one who had handled Tom's estate. I heard her say the words that confirmed my worst fears. Yes, that's right. I want to transfer the entire principal from the trust into the new account. I know it's irrevocable. Julian explained it all. She was moving the entire inheritance, the fortress Tom had built to protect his family, into a single unaudited account controlled by a man she had known for less than a year. I confronted her after the call. I was not gentle this time. Evelyn, you cannot do this. You are putting everything Tom worked for at risk. You are gambling with your son's future. This man is a stranger. The reaction was explosive. He is not a stranger. He is the man I love. She'd cried, her face flushed with anger and hurt. And you are a senile old man who is so stuck in the past. You can't stand to see me happy. You think everyone is a criminal. You think every new idea is a scam. Tom is gone. Dad, I have to live in the world of today, not the world of yesterday. Julian understands that. He supports me. You just criticize. I'm not criticizing, I'm protecting you. I don't need your protection, she'd yelled. I need you to trust me. Julian and I are building a future together. In fact, her expression shifted from anger to a kind of defiant triumph. We're getting engaged. He's planning a party for our announcement in a few weeks. She looked at me, her eyes cold. You can either be happy for me or you can stay home with your dusty old ledgers. She had thrown down the gauntlet. She had chosen him and his glittering promises over me and my cautious wisdom. As I drove home that day, my heart a heavy aching stone in my chest, I knew I had lost her trust. But I could not lose her future. The time for gentle warnings was over. My daughter saw me as a senile old man. It was time to show her what a retired bank manager could do. A bank manager, a good one anyway, is a peculiar sort of detective. He doesn't hunt for criminals in dark alleys. He hunts for them in the bright clinical light of financial statements. He looks for the subtle, tells the inflated asset that has no real-world value, the liability that has been conveniently omitted, the cash flow that moves in illogical circles. He follows the paper trail because paper, unlike people, rarely lies. My first step was to establish a baseline. Who was Julian Croft? He claimed to have an MBA from a prestigious business school and a decade of experience at a major Wall Street firm. These were verifiable facts. I started there. I still had a few old friends in the banking industry, men like me who were now retired but still kept a hand in the game. I called my old friend Henry, who had spent his entire career in compliance. Henry. I said, I need a favor. I need to verify an employment record. A man named Julian Croft says he worked at Goldman Sachs from roughly 2010 to 2020. Henry called me back 2 days later. Arthur, are you sitting down? There is no record of any Julian Croft ever having worked at Goldman, or Morgan Stanley, or any other major firm. I ran his name through every database I have access to. As far as Wall Street is concerned, the man is a ghost. The first brick of his carefully constructed identity had just crumbled. The prestigious career was a lie. Next, the education. I contacted the registrar's office at the university he claimed as his alma mater. They, too, had no record of a Julian Croft ever receiving an MBA. So who was he? The modern world, for all its complexity, has one great weakness. It has a long memory. I hired a private investigator, a former police detective named McCann, whom I had worked with on a fraud case years ago. He was old school, a man who knew how to dig. I didn't give him the whole story. I just told him I was conducting a background check on a potential business partner for my daughter. Give me everything you can find on Julian Croft, I told him. And I mean everything. Credit history, past addresses, business filings, the works. While McCann began his digital and physical excavation, I focused on the investment. Julian had been smart enough not to leave a paper trail with Evie, but I knew he must have a corporate entity. I used a public records database to search for all LLCs registered in the state over the past year with him as an officer. I found it Croft Global Ventures LLC, registered just 3 weeks after he had met my daughter. The address was a mail drop. The corporate structure was a ghost, a shell with no substance, but it had a bank account, and with a little help from another old contact, I was able to find out where that account was domiciled, a bank in the Cayman Islands, a place where money goes to disappear. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was uglier with every detail. Julian was no financial guru. He was a predator, and he had built a sophisticated trap specifically for my daughter. While I was digging, Julian was building his fortress. He proposed to Evie with a diamond ring that was ostentatiously large. She, of course, said yes. The engagement party was set for a month away to be held at a lavish downtown hotel. The invitations went out. The happy couple was celebrated by all their friends, who saw only the charming facade. I felt a desperate sense of urgency. I had to warn her before she transferred the trust fund. I went to her house armed with my preliminary findings, the fake employment history, the phantom MBA. I laid it out for her calmly, factually. Evie, the man is not who he says he is. His entire resume is a fabrication. She listened, her arms crossed her face, a mask of cold fury. When I was done, she didn't question my evidence. She attacked my motive. So you hired a private investigator to spy on the man I love, she said, her voice dripping with venom. You went behind my back to dig up dirt to try and find something, anything, to ruin this for me. I can't believe you, Dad. This isn't concern. This is control. You can't stand that I've found someone who isn't like you or Tom, someone who takes risks, someone who is exciting. This isn't about excitement, it's about lies, I pleaded. They're not lies, she shot back. Maybe he embellished his resume a little. Who doesn't? He's a private consultant. He doesn't need a fancy Wall Street pedigree. His results are what matter. What results? Where are they? All I see is your money disappearing into a black hole. That's it, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. She walked to the door and held it open. I want you to leave. Do not call me. Do not come here. You are invited to the engagement party as my father. You will come, you will smile, you will be happy for me, and you will not say one more word about this. If you cannot do that, then you are no longer welcome in my life. The ultimatum was absolute. I had been banished. I stood on her porch, the door closed in my face, and I felt a despair so profound it almost brought me to my knees. I had the facts, but I had lost the trust. 2 days before the engagement party, McCann delivered his final report. It was the key, the one piece of evidence so damning that not even a daughter blinded by love could ignore it. Julian Croft was not his real name. He had been born Jonathan Vance. And under that name in Arizona 6 years prior, he had been convicted of fraud. He had scammed a 62-year-old widow out of her entire retirement savings using an almost identical investment scheme. He had served 18 months in a state prison. McCann had included a copy of the court records and a mugshot. The man staring out from the photo was younger, thinner, but the eyes, the cold, predatory eyes, were unmistakably the same. I now had the truth, the whole ugly, irrefutable truth. But I had been forbidden from speaking it. The engagement party was my last and only chance. I had to walk into a room full of happy people celebrating a lie and detonate a bomb that would shatter my daughter's world. It was the hardest decision of my life, but it was also the only one. A father's duty is not to ensure his child's happiness. It is to ensure their survival. The 2 days leading up to the engagement party were the longest of my life. My quiet, orderly house felt like a command bunker in the tense hours before a major offensive. The black binder containing McCann's report and my own research sat on my desk, a silent, heavy presence. It was a dossier of deceit, a ledger of a man's corrupted soul. I read through it a dozen times, not to reassure myself of the facts, but to fortify my own resolve. Each page was a fresh wave of cold fury. The falsified degrees, the string of failed companies, the fake testimonials, it was all the work of a seasoned predator. But it was the final section, the file on Jonathan Vance, that made my blood run cold. The court documents from Arizona were a chilling blueprint for what he was doing to Evie. The victim was a schoolteacher recently widowed who had trusted him with her husband's pension. He had charmed her, isolated her from her skeptical children, and then vanished with every penny. The parallels were exact, a predatory pattern repeated with horrifying precision. I had the ammunition. Now I had to plan the attack. My first instinct, the father's instinct, was to race to Evie's house, throw the file down in front of her and force her to see the truth. But I knew how she would react. She would see it as a final desperate act of sabotage. She would call Julian, and he, knowing the game was up, would flee. He would disappear with the $250,000 of Tom's money he had already convinced her to invest in his feeder funds. The rest of the inheritance, the main trust fund, was still safe. Pending the final transfer she was set to authorize after the engagement. I had one shot to stop that transfer and hopefully to recover what was already lost. The engagement party was the perfect, terrible arena. It was a public celebration of their union, a moment when they would be surrounded by friends and family who were all invested in the happy illusion. To detonate the truth, there would be cruel. It would be a spectacle of humiliation for my daughter, but it was also the only place where Julian would be trapped, overconfident and unable to escape. It was the only way to ensure Evie would be surrounded by a support system when her world came crashing down. My strategic plan, honed by years of assessing risk for the bank, was simple. I would not make a scene upon arrival. I would play the part she had assigned me, the dutiful, smiling father. I would wait until the moment of maximum public commitment, the moment Julian and Evie were the center of everyone's attention. The toasts. That would be the moment. I would raise a glass not to their future, but to Julian's past. The night before the party, I sat alone in my study, a glass of bourbon in my trembling hand. The tremor was worse than ever, a physical manifestation of the storm raging inside me. I looked at the photograph of my wife, Margaret, on my desk. Her smile was a beacon of warmth and sanity. "What would you do, Maggie?" I whispered to the empty room. And in the quiet of my heart, I knew. She would have done the same thing. She would have walked through fire to protect her child, even if it meant getting burned. The next evening I dressed with the meticulous care of a man preparing for battle. I chose a simple, dark, conservative suit, the armor of a banker. I placed the black binder inside a slim, elegant briefcase. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes heavy with the burden of what I was about to do. I looked old. I looked tired. I thought with a grim irony, senile. But my resolve was as hard and clear as a diamond. The drive to the hotel was a journey through a foreign land. The city glittered with a festive, careless energy. Every window seemed to be filled with happy people, their lives untouched by the kind of deceit that was about to unfold. For a moment I was tempted to turn back to let Evie have her night of blissful ignorance. But then I saw Tom's face in my mind's eye, his honest, trusting smile. I had made a silent promise to him at his funeral, a promise to watch over his family. I would not break that promise. I gave my keys to the valet and walked into the hotel lobby. The party was in the main ballroom. I could hear the sound of a string quartet and the cheerful, bubbling chatter of 100 voices. I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and walked into the ambush. The ballroom was a sea of champagne flutes and shimmering dresses. A massive ice sculpture of 2 swans graced the center of the room, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and catered hors d'oeuvres. It was a perfect illusion of happiness and prosperity. I saw Evie immediately. She was a vision in a sapphire blue dress, her face radiant with a joy that was almost painful to behold. She was standing with Julian, her hand tucked possessively in the crook of his arm. He was in his element, holding court, his laugh booming through the room, accepting congratulations with the practiced ease of a born winner. They were the king and queen of this glittering temporary kingdom. Evie saw me, and for a moment a look of nervous apprehension crossed her face. But then she straightened her shoulders, took a sip of champagne, and approached me, Julian in tow. "Dad," she said, her voice a little too bright. "You came. I'm so glad." "You look beautiful, Evelyn," I said, kissing her cheek. "Arthur." "Good to see you," Julian said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Glad you could put the old grudges aside for one night. It means the world to Evie." He was already claiming victory, already positioning me as the difficult old man who had finally seen the light. I simply nodded, my face a neutral mask. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and retreated to a quiet corner, my briefcase a heavy, comforting weight in my hand. For the next hour, I played my part. I made polite conversation. I smiled. I watched as my daughter, my only child, basked in the glow of a lie. Every laugh, every toast, every congratulatory hug she received felt like a turn of the knife in my gut. Finally, the moment came. The string quartet fell silent. A man who I presumed was Evie's best friend tapped a glass with a spoon. It was time for the toasts. Several friends spoke, telling charming anecdotes about Evie and extolling Julian's virtues. And then Julian himself took the floor. He raised his glass, his eyes sweeping the room, before settling on my daughter with a look of practiced adoration. To my Evelyn, he began his voice a smooth, confident purr. A woman who has shown me what true love and trust really mean. For those of you who know her story, you know she has been through the darkness. I am the luckiest man in the world that she has chosen me to be her partner in building a new, brilliant, and prosperous future. He looked around the room. A future of security, of happiness, and of leaving all the worries of the past behind. He raised his glass higher. To Evie, the room erupted in a chorus of "To Evie." As the applause died down, and just as the band was about to start up again, I stood. "If I may," I said, my voice carrying a quiet authority that made the room fall silent once more. As the father of the bride-to-be, I feel it is my duty to say a few words about the man who has captured my daughter's heart. A wave of relief washed over Evie's face. She thought I was finally capitulating, finally giving my blessing. Julian's smile widened. He had won. I walked to the center of the room, placing my briefcase on a small table. I did not raise a glass. I opened the briefcase. Julian Croft is a truly remarkable man. I began, my eyes locked on his. A man of many talents and of many stories. I have spent the last few months, as any concerned father would, learning some of those stories. And tonight, in the spirit of family and full disclosure, I would like to share one of them with you. Julian's smile faltered. Evie's face clouded with confusion and a dawning dread. I took the first document from my binder. Most of you know Julian as a brilliant financial advisor, but I'd like to introduce you to another man, a man named Jonathan Vance. I held up a clear-color copy of his mugshot from Arizona. The room gasped. In Arizona 6 years ago, Jonathan Vance was a brilliant advisor to another woman, a 62-year-old widow, a schoolteacher. He promised her a brilliant future, too. He took her life savings, every last penny, and disappeared. This is insane. Julian sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. He's a senile old man making up lies, am I said calmly. I pressed a button on a small digital voice recorder I had placed on the table. A woman's voice, frail but clear, filled the silent room. It was the sworn recorded testimony of the widow from Arizona, a statement I had obtained from McCann. She told the story of his charm, his promises, and his ultimate betrayal. When it ended, the silence was absolute. I laid the next document on the table. Jonathan Vance, or Julian Croft, as he now calls himself, served 18 months in a state penitentiary for fraud. Here is a copy of the court record. I continued, my voice the steady, dispassionate tone of an auditor delivering his findings. I presented the evidence of his fake credentials of the shell corporation of the offshore bank account. With each new exhibit, another layer of his charming facade was stripped away, revealing the ugly, predatory truth underneath. I saved the final piece for Evie. I looked at my daughter, whose face was a tragic mask of horror, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. And this sweetheart, I said, my voice finally softening with a father's grief, is the account in the Cayman Islands, where the first $250,000 of your husband's legacy has already been transferred. The trust fund, the rest of it was next. I closed the binder. My presentation was complete. Julian stood frozen for a moment, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, an ally. He found none. Every face was turned to him with a look of utter contempt. His world had not just collapsed. It had been methodically, publicly, and irrefutably dismantled. He turned and lunged for the exit, not walking, but running a disgraced coward fleeing the scene of his final failed con. In the wake of Julian's desperate flight, a stunned, horrified silence held the ballroom captive. The festive decorations, the champagne, the half-eaten canapes, it all seemed like a grotesque parody of a celebration. The ice swans were beginning to melt their elegant forms, slumping into a distorted, watery ruin, a perfect metaphor for the evening. Then the murmurs began. Voices filled with shock pity and a rising tide of anger. I saw one of Evie's friends, a sharp-looking woman who I knew was a lawyer, already on her phone, likely speaking to the police. The party was over. The illusion had been shattered. My focus, however, was singular. It was on my daughter. Evelyn stood motionless in the center of the room, a solitary island in a sea of shocked faces. Her own face was a blank canvas, her eyes wide and unfocused, staring at the spot where the man she thought she loved had just been standing. She wasn't crying anymore. She seemed to have moved past tears into a place of pure, desolate shock. She looked fragile, like a piece of fine porcelain that had been dropped and was holding its shape for one precarious moment before it crumbled into 1,000 pieces. I walked to her side, moving through the crowd that parted for me as if by magic. I was no longer the senile old fool in the corner. I was the man who had seen the truth. I gently took her arm. "Let's go home, sweetheart," I whispered. She didn't resist. She allowed me to guide her out of the ballroom, away from the sympathetic and curious stares, away from the wreckage of her life. As we walked through the hotel lobby, she finally began to shake her whole body, trembling with the force of her suppressed sobs. I held her close, my strong, steady presence the only anchor in her storm. The weeks that followed were a quiet, painful blur of legal proceedings and emotional recovery. The police, armed with my meticulously prepared dossier, were able to freeze the offshore account before Julian could empty it completely. They eventually caught him in a cheap motel in Nevada, trying to assemble a new identity. Most of Evie's money was recovered. The law for once moved with a satisfying swiftness, but the financial recovery was the easy part. The healing of my daughter's heart and of her trust was a much slower, more delicate process. She moved in with me for a while into her old childhood bedroom. She was quiet, withdrawn, and wrapped in a thick blanket of shame. She wouldn't talk about Julian, or about the engagement, or about anything that had happened. She just existed, a ghost in her own past. I didn't push. I just provided a quiet, stable presence. I made her tea. I sat with her in the garden. I let the steady, predictable rhythm of my orderly life be a comfort to her. The breakthrough came one rainy Saturday afternoon, about a month after the disastrous party. She came into my study where I was balancing my monthly budget, the familiar ritual a source of calm for me. She sat in the chair opposite my desk, the same chair where so many of my bank clients had once sat. I was so stupid, she said her first voluntary words on the subject. "You were grieving," I corrected gently. "And you were hopeful." "He didn't sell you an investment, Evie. He sold you a fantasy. The fantasy of a life without pain, without worry. It's the most powerful product in the world." She looked at the neat columns of my ledger book, at the precise, careful handwriting. "You tried to tell me," she said, her voice filled with regret. "You saw it from the very beginning. But I wouldn't listen. I thought your caution was a weakness, a flaw. I thought you were afraid of the world. I'm not afraid of the world," I said, setting down my pen. "I just believe in doing the due diligence, in business and in life. You have to look past the brochure and read the fine print." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Will, you teach me?" Teach you what, sweetheart? How to read the fine print, she said, a flicker of the old strong Evie returning to her eyes. How to balance the books? How to be the one in control of my own future? I don't ever want to be that blind, that vulnerable again. A slow, warm smile spread across my face. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the true resolution. It wasn't about Julian's defeat or about me being right. It was about this. It was about my daughter finding her strength again. I pulled a fresh ledger book from my desk drawer and slid it across the polished wood to her. I handed her a sharpened pencil. "Of course I will," I said. "Let's start with the first principle. Let's talk about assets and liabilities." We sat there for hours, the rain tapping gently against the window pane. I watched as she took her first tentative steps into a world of financial literacy, a world of self-reliance. I was not just teaching her about money. I was giving her back her armor. The books of her life were out of balance, written in the red ink of grief and betrayal. But now together we would begin the slow, meticulous, and deeply satisfying work of making them whole again. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates the power of quiet wisdom. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.